Is it what?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
He said he's going to
Should be determined. Very curious. I did say that's not. Did they give you a clicker?
It's not something you know when you're 21.
yes.
Do you know that you have the PowerPoint behind you?
Awesome. That fixed.
Yeah, and you should have a clicker that works. Okay.
All right, welcome back, those of you who endured the morning, you're willing to endure the afternoon. So our second session, I think we actually got this thing up and running, so that's wonderful. Thank you, whoever did that work. Stewardship and as the mission of the church. The introduction here is, imagine no campaign. This morning, I offered a story that went something like this. Stewardship is about what God wants us to do with what God gives us. Moreover, it is God's gift to us to draw us out of ourselves into the riches, the abundant life of communion with others. This afternoon, I want to continue our reflections by focusing on stewardship and the mission of the church. To begin, I want to ask a companion question to the question that framed this morning, that started this morning. Can you imagine a congregational culture where a stewardship campaign was not necessary and that did not depend upon an endowment? Where giving and generosity was not just something we did a little of from time to time, but was the fundamental orientation of our lives and a distinguishing characteristic of our communities, something for which we were known. First subpoint this morning is stewardship and a big enough mission. I suggested earlier that much of what passes for stewardship renders God small, territorial. This conclusion is reached by the National Study of Youth, this is reinforced by the National Study of Youth and Religion, led by Chris Smith and popularized by Kenda Creasy-Dean in her book, Almost Christian. It's a wonderful book if you don't know. This study of the religious lives of young people suggests that too many churches are inhabited by this shrunken, shriveled God. Specifically, the study concludes, as I suggested this morning in our sort of roundtable discussion, specifically the study concludes that contrary to popular mythology, young people are not alienated from or hostile to religion. As Smith writes, very few are restless, alienated, or rebellious. Rather, the majority of U.S. teenagers seem basically content to follow the faith of their families with little questioning. When it comes to religion, they are quite happy to go along and get along. This, however, is not good news or grounds for relief, because as Kendrick Creasy Dean writes, the bad news is the reason teenagers are not hostile toward religion. They just do not care about it very much. Religion is not a big deal for them. The operative word the authors of this study offer in relation to young persons to religion is indifference. Indifference. Why are young people indifferent? Because that is what they have learned from us. Listen to Dean again. The problem does not seem to be that the churches are teaching young people badly. Like, we're trying to tell them good stuff, they're just not getting it. But that they are doing an exceedingly good job of teaching youth what we really believe. Namely, that Christianity is not a big deal. That God requires little. The church is full of basically nice people just like ourselves. As my pastor said recently in a sermon, God does not ask much of us, just a little. The National Study of Youth and Religion suggests that the tiny territorial God who only wants a few percent and a little time is too small to hold our attention, to inspire commitment, to drive action, or instill purpose and direction. In short, this is a rather benign God who neither calls nor offers much. This tiny God does not call us out of our sin-induced self-absorption. Indeed, far from challenging this God reinforces the widespread conviction that the central goal in life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. According to the story of this tiny God, Jesus is determined to see that our will be done. Now, what has this to do with stewardship? The National Study of Youth and Religion suggests that our stewardship struggle is related, it's part and parcel of a mission problem. A mission problem. Humans want to be part of something larger than ourselves. Our hearts are restless, right? Like a deer panting for water. We long for that which would slake our thirst for recognition, our desire to be embraced, to be welcomed, to find a home. The problem is that our culture tells us that we are the center of all things, the ingrown self. The individual is sacred and sovereign. And the story of stuff told by in our consumerist culture, the story of stuff told by our consumerist culture, tells us that we can accumulate and consume our way to wholeness, to satisfaction, and to joy. And the National Study of Youth and Religion suggests that the church caters to this ingrown self. The tiny God of contemporary stewardship offers little resistance to this ingrown self. I mean, think of how hard it has been during the pandemic to convince folks to wear a mask, even, especially in the church, because it was an infringement upon their individual sovereignty. And that's a striking thing, isn't it? We who are called to take up the cross find this to be an unbelievable burden? That's bizarre. Take up the cross and follow me. Not if I gotta wear a mask. But you all know this, right? We can't consume our way to wholeness. The ingrown self is like a black hole, a vacuum, a void that leads only to the hell of nihilism. Joy is only found in reversing the direction of sin. From consumption to generosity, from being turned inward to being turned outward, from grasping and accumulating to giving and receiving and sharing in community. And this is where stewardship comes in. Stewardship is the gift of a big enough mission to satisfy our restless hearts. God gives us the gift of stewardship as our mission because God wants to bless us richly. Stewardship is an opportunity, an invitation that God gives us to be drawn out of the darkness of our ingrown selves and into the ecstatic joy of community with others. Stewardship is good news. It's what God gives us to do to get our attention off ourselves, which is killing us. And Chris Smith and his cohorts that are doing all this work on generosity support the correlation. Their sociological work supports the correlation between generosity, fulfillment, and happiness. Conversely, there's a whole interdisciplinary study going around the world called happiness studies or happiness literature that shows very clearly that there is no correlation between consumption and happiness. Generosity correlates with happiness, with self-reported happiness. Consumption doesn't. Second subpoint, our edifice complex. Our mission problem is related to our edifice complex. To explain, I'm going to begin with a modern paraphrase from Acts 2. And for the sake of time, I'm going to read it quickly, but I think you'll have no problem following along. My eyes are drying out here. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the place. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and where each tongue rested, there appeared a building. Each building was filled with the Holy Spirit. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at the sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each saw a building in the style of their native land. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are we not in Jerusalem? How is it that we see each of us a building in our native style? Basilicas, mausoleums, round buildings with conical roofs, Gothic buildings, Romanesque buildings, Renaissance buildings, Byzantine buildings, Revival-style buildings, log-stave buildings, sod buildings, octagonal buildings, buildings that look like inverted Viking ships, monolithic buildings, reinforced concrete buildings, wood buildings, stone buildings, brick buildings, Abbey-style buildings, Bauhaus-style buildings, cathedral buildings, Rococo-style buildings, multi-purpose buildings, circular buildings, Victorian buildings, Russian Revival buildings, Baroque buildings, Akron plan buildings, buildings with climbing walls, buildings with theater-style seating, buildings with a font near the door, buildings with freestanding altars, buildings with altars fixed against the wall. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" What does this mean? Ben Witherington suggests, well, you can actually read along, I hope. Ben Witherington suggests it is time for Western churches, especially those in North America, to rethink their edifice complex. Can it really be justified to spend millions and millions of dollars on elaborate buildings which mainly serve only ourselves and then struggle to raise money for mission budgets? The church is largely no longer a missionary movement. It is a self-nurturing entity which has a missions committee and a budget, but spends most of its money on itself. There is a difference between this and what one reads about in Paul's letters. How often do we hear the claim that the church is not a building, it is the people? The truth, however, is that modern mainline North American denominations largely act as if the church really is a building. Check most any church website, and what is the first thing you see? A building, and then programs and staff. Listen to Christians. How often do we talk about going to church? And how often does talk about stewardship mean contributing to the upkeep of the building, its staff, and the institution known as a denomination? Isn't becoming a Christian synonymous with going to church? And when the same leaders of this church talk about the church's mission and ministry, they are talking about the corporate activity of that institution. Ask laity and clergy, I was tempted to ask you all, where is your church? And the inevitable response will be an address, a location of a building. And we speak of building new churches and closing churches when we erect and close buildings. The Reformation definition of a church, right, a place where the word is proclaimed and the sacraments are duly administered, it really doesn't help us move away from thinking of church as a place, as a building. And I think about during COVID, right, how many clergy complained that church buildings were not declared essential. What does that tell us when we think buildings are essential to church? One of the marks of modernity is the development of large bureaucratic institutions inhabited by managers, experts, therapists. Our edifice complex suggests we have bought into this culture. Too often, when we speak of the church, we are referring to a modern bureaucratic institution staffed by managers, therapists, with lots of volunteer help, whose mission is maintenance. That is, the church is an institution in the business of maintaining itself by means of providing a host of services, religious services, meaning and purpose, therapy, child socialization, family support, a little charity to feel good about, etc. And then holding stewardship campaigns once a year to get God's cut from sovereign consumers of those services. Kind of reminds me of the PBS pledge drive. And to add insult to injury, it's painful to say this because it reflects me too. Clergy and roster leaders are really just glorified property managers. And like good property managers, you organize activities and events for the renters and members. Again, our edifice complex, seeing church as the programs associated with the building and its professional staff, obstructs our ability to fully appreciate the gift that God gives in stewardship. The gift of enlisting our lives, all that we are and all that we have, in the mission that is the ecstatic movement of love to extend community. So I want to suggest that thinking, rethinking, redeeming stewardship entails seeing and practicing church not as a building, not even simply as a people, but rather rethink church as a people on a mission. I've forgotten what my own slides look like. Point C. From going to church, to being the church, to the church giving itself away. The traditional name for the doctrine of the church is, right, ecclesiology. Following Graham Ward, I'm going to suggest that regardless of the term we should think ecclesiality. Ecclesiality. What does this mean? What does the shift mean? And what's at stake for the practice of stewardship? Put succinctly, ecclesiality has to do not with going to church, but with being the church. Church names what Christians do 168 hours a week. It's our vocations. Church names a people on a mission. Church is not a place or a time. It's not a building, a campus, a modern bureaucratic institution, and or its professional staff and programming. It is a corporate way of living and acting in the world for the sake of the renewal of community. Church is another name for the people of God on a mission. Church is another name for the people of God on a mission. What does this mean for stewardship? Stewardship is another name for discipleship, for our way of living and acting in the world, for our mission. Which means that stewardship is not about giving to the church. It is about the church giving itself away. Stewardship is not about giving to church. It is about the church giving itself away. It is the mission, the labor of communion. The church does not exist for us to serve us. Rather, the church exists. We are gathered for the sake of the world, to serve the world. The church exists to image the prodigal God. Church is to embody, enact God's philanthropia, God's love of humanity. That's what we are to image in the world, to enact in the world. Remember Luther's freedom of a Christian, right? Stick a fork in us, we're done. From that point on, once we've got Jesus, our life is a surplus to be given away for the world. That's stewardship. Not giving to the church, but the church giving itself away. I suppose it's worth noting that one of the shifts this entails, it's going to be hard for us in this room. We're not that important. Right now, we're kind of the center, right? Church leaders are often the center of the life of the church. But just do the math. Add up all the people in the church, all the people who are the church, and then multiply that times 168. All the church leaders, we don't add up to that many hours. The laity are the center of God's activity, of the Christian practice of stewardship. Because they're the ones that are doing most of the hours. They're putting in most of the hours. Just do the math, right? So it really decenters us. It decenters us. The next point. Oh, sorry, I'm really not good at this. Point D. Maybe I should just go ahead and put all the points up there so then I won't get too far behind. Leading the church and giving itself away. So now I'd like to turn to the challenges surrounding moving from the too typical story of stuff to this more expansive notion of stewardship. And so I'm going to offer a kind of disorganized list of practices for you to try at home, so to speak. You ready? Offer, require tithing. Just like you offer, require confessing the faith and renouncing sin, death, and the devil. And then maybe follow it up with offering, requiring an annual financial disclosure. And then introduce graduated tithing. If you're not familiar with it, check out Ron Sider's Rich Christians in the Age of Hunger. A really wonderful book, and it's on the list of resources I'll start with at the end. Develop a congregational budget in line with the best-run charities. According to Charity Watch, that means 75% goes out the door. Move closer together in a community, neighborhood, maybe within walking, biking, or scooting distance. Give your building to the local community. Refuse to accept interest on your money, personally and corporately. Practice fasting, personally and corporately. Teach and practice the freedom of simplicity. Offer, require small groups of support and accountability. Maybe small groups and support and accountability regarding budgeting, right? There's a nice movement. I think this is actually a good thing. You know, the whole Dave Ramsey is helping people sort of get a handle on their finances instead of their finances controlling them. It's not a bad thing. Or find small groups to explore the practice of simplicity. Again, I'll offer some references. And this includes small groups that maybe get together where we open up and share our checkbooks with one another. Form small groups for vocational support, like I mentioned earlier in the day, right? Offer scholarships to everyone going into ministry. And of course, by ministry, or one of my favorite ones, because I get so tired of churches enabling homelessness, baptize and enroll all the homeless in your community as members of your congregation. Now, of course, these practices are pretty much unimaginable, if not incomprehensible, from the perspective of the standard story of stewardship, from the culture of part-time Christianity that leaves the ingrown sovereign self intact, drowning in our culture of consumerism. Nevertheless, I'm not being flippant or facetious. I'm tempted to laugh, but if I laugh, and I know these are kind of outrageous things I've just suggested, but you know, we worship an outrageous God. I offer these suggestions with all sincerity and honesty because I believe that were you to introduce them into the life of your congregation, your stewardship problems would largely disappear. Remember, how we use resources not only expresses our character, but it shapes our character as well. Use resources in a manner that reflects who you want to be, and you will become that person, that congregation. Right? Matthew 6:21, our heart follows our treasure. That's the point of all these suggestions above. Now, I admit that all these suggestions are not quick fixes, and that these suggestions presuppose several things. The first thing they presuppose is leadership. Living this vision of stewardship requires leadership. Leadership, not management. Management is maintaining systems and processes, maintaining the status quo, homeostasis. The mission is maintenance. Leadership is inspiring people to believe, to commit, to follow, to change, to move, to grow. The skills needed for managing an institution for maintenance or for meeting the felt needs of ingrown individuals are different than the skills needed for leading people in the mission of embodying God's generosity for the sake of extending communion and community. Put differently, in keeping with this vision of stewardship, your calling as church leaders is to serve the church in a particular way, by leading it, equipping it in service, stewardship, giving itself away. You are not called to be chaplains to commuter chapels of the middle-class American consumerist way of life. You are serving folks whose entire life is now a surplus to be given away in loving service to their neighbors. Mind you, this doesn't mean that you ignore the 99 sheep or the healthy. I'm not suggesting that. But you tend them best when you help them live into their calling, their mission that is stewardship. Help them give themselves away. The problem is that we're not really prepared to do this. By and large, we are prepared by the various facets of our training, seminary and whatnot, to manage, not lead change, especially in times of discontinuous change, high anxiety, and adaptive challenge, where our old skills and our old ways of dealing with change just don't work anymore. I admit it. I know, I worked here, I tried to teach. I saw the problems. I can give you all the greatest ideas in the world, supposing I actually had some great ideas. I could give you all the greatest ideas in the world, but it does no good if I don't help you learn the skills to actually carry those into life in a congregation. Fortunately, there are good resources out there for making up this gap, this missing element in our formation and training. There's some listed at the end of the workshop today. So it presumes leadership, and I admit, I haven't done a good job helping you with that one. It presumes character. Character, both personal and corporate congregational. On the personal level, many people think that leadership is anchored in authority derived from positional power, from institutional position. But the real measure of leadership is influence. Influence. And especially today, influence is built on character. Earlier generations were much more deferential to institutional power. I could just show up with the institutional credentials behind me and people would listen. Not so anymore. Not so in this postmodern era we're in. People look for not institutional authority, but authenticity, personal integrity. They want to see that your words match your character. Now, with regard to stewardship, one of the challenges is, and this again comes out of Christian Smith's research and talking with all kinds of Christians and Christian leaders about giving and stewardship, one of the huge challenges is that clergy admit that they do not have their own houses in order, that their own practice of stewardship is anemic. And look, it's no surprise. We live in the same consumer culture. We suffer from the same being curved in on ourselves with nearly the same lack of support and accountability as everyone else. If we do not live and give generously, prodigally, then it is completely understandable. It's completely understandably difficult to encourage others to do the same because leadership entails modeling. Well, the good news, here's the good news. The good news is that sanctification is a process. Growth in grace and holiness admit of degrees. Even backsliding. Some of us are even good at backsliding. You don't need to have it all figured out. You can be honest about the challenges. Living into the mission, the gift that God gives us called stewardship, is no different than living into the gift that God gives us in the Ten Commandments. Right? We don't preach and teach the Ten Commandments because we've got them all figured out and living perfectly, do we? The same thing goes with stewardship. We can admit we don't have our houses in order, just like we don't have our houses in order about a lot of other things, and still move forward with our congregations. The important thing is being on the way. The important thing is embracing the gifts that God gives to heal our sin-sick souls. In this regard, there's a host of spiritual disciplines around simplicity. And again, I'll give you some recommended resources as places to start if you want to on the last slide. Moving from personal to congregational character. When we talk about leading a congregation and giving itself away, we are not simply talking about providing new information. We are talking about leading a culture change from what has been called scarcity to abundance, right? From a paying the bills culture to a living the vision culture. I get that from Smith. From a tiny vision of stewardship with a tiny God to a more comprehensive, bigger one. We are talking about the culture or character of a congregation. Is it known for its prodigal generosity and renewing and extending community and communion? In this regard, consider these practices. Foster a better theological vision, which means don't plead for money, instead facilitate expanding and deepening faith. Tell a better story of stuff and of God. God wants to bless us more richly and abundantly than we could ever ask or imagine. God wants to bless all of us, not just 2%, not just 3%, not just a little bit of our time and talents that we give to the church. God wants to redeem all of us. And one of the awesome gifts that God in Christ gives us for the sake of our redemption is stewardship. Stewardship is good news. It's a blessing. It's a gift. It's one of the ways God is redeeming us, getting out of this ingrown self and opening us up to the joy, the love that is communion with others. Right? That's telling a better story of God and stuff. Hello? Expand the practice of discipleship. Challenge part-time Christianity and the ingrown individual. How do we do this? Well, the first thing we got to do is make sure we are not inadvertently, accidentally saying stupid things that shrink God and God's gifts. Like, God only wants 10%, and then you can do what the rest. God doesn't ask much, just a little. That's just not helpful. And I know the people who said that didn't mean to say discipleship's part-time. It only concerns these things. They inadvertently did this. So the first thing we had to do is check ourselves. Make sure we're not inadvertently saying stupid things. Remind folks. Proclaim, don't just remind. Why do we want to remind? We want to proclaim this from the rooftops. The good news is that we are enlisted in something bigger than ourselves. Better than our ingrown selves. Christianity is 168 hours a week. And that's good news. Offer Christianity not as a Gnostic idea. I've got these ideas in my head which make sure I'm going to get into heaven. It's not secret knowledge. We're not entirely Gnostic. The Gnostics thought it was secret. We think it's available for everybody, but it's still fundamentally Gnostic. Christianity is I got the right ideas that ensure I get into heaven. And tons of people believe this. I know because I teach the kids. I teach the young people that come out of your churches, my churches. That's the one good thing about doing the Religion 100 course at LRU is I get to see what these young people believe who are in churches all around us. And that's what I hear. Offer Christianity not as a Gnostic idea, but as a different and better way of living now. Salvation is sanctification, being set free from sin, from the ingrown self, via the means of grace, the spiritual disciplines, the works of piety, the works of mercy. Think of all the hobbies, the careers, the athletics that people really commit to. They love doing that stuff. Think of the hobbies. Think in your own life, the passion you put into your hobbies, and the time and the effort and the energy and the training and the continuing education and the practice and the formation. And compare that to typical Christianity. We provide a little bit of information that people largely forget. And we expect little in the way of commitment, and we offer little in the way of support for the gift of growing in holiness. Challenge the culture. Challenge the culture and the practice of privacy, of hiding, that says stewardship is off limits. Many congregations have an unspoken rule that clergy are only permitted to talk about stewardship. Specifically, they're only allowed to talk about church budgets and contributions to the church. We're not really supposed to talk about personal spiritual issues around money and the use of resources. We need to break through that. We can't abandon people. That's what we're doing. We're abandoning people when we respect that privacy. We abandon them. We leave them without support and accountability. We deny them the gift, the blessing that God gives by giving us stewardship. I mean, if stewardship is good news, then we want to offer this to folks. If we really believe it's God's gift to us to get us from out of our being turned in on ourselves, then we want to share this. We can't help but share this. And when we don't share it, we're not doing them a favor. We're hurting them. We're leaving them in the ingrown self. We're denying them the possibility, the gift, the blessing of being open to the joys of receiving and giving to others. We need to encourage vocations, as I've suggested several times now, right? We need to expand the understanding and practice of generosity. We need to expand the understanding and practice of generosity beyond church campus, beyond charity and volunteer activity. And the list you see there, I'll walk through it briefly. The list you see there is something I've gleaned from a couple of the books from Christian Smith in his work on generosity and the folks that he worked with on this study of generosity. And then I've added my own twist to a couple of them. We need to think about, expand the understanding and practice of generosity to include, of course, financial giving and volunteering. Those are things we all naturally think of, I suppose. To include relational generosity, aiding friends and family and neighbors. Neighborly generosity, right? The NGOs and the big nonprofits that we think of. Lending possessions. Even self-sufficiency in a sense, not like give the person a fish and go away. Self-sufficiency is a form of generosity in the sense of 2 Thessalonians 3, where Paul says, right, if you don't work, you don't eat. What he's really saying is, if you don't need the community's resources, don't draw on them, so that we can give them to those who do need them. And so self-sufficiency in that sense, not taking the community's resources when I don't need them, is a form of generosity. It's freeing up resources to be circulated in this universal destination of material goods. Political activism is a form of generosity. Environmental sustainability is a form of generosity. Giving for the sake of, caring for creation. Blood and organ donation, the state of giving. And then, as I've said many times today, vocation is a form of generosity. And if you read the works by Christian Smith and his colleagues on generosity, you're going to see that's one of the weaknesses of his work. when I finished reading the book, I emailed him, because I used to know him in graduate school about this, and he said, yeah, I got him on that one. He still thinks that generosity is a sort of a vocation. When a really key thing I'm pressing here is we need to help people see stewardship and their vocations as a form of generosity. How is what the folks in your congregation do every day a form of generosity? In some cases, they're going to say it's not a form of generosity, which is a huge red flag that maybe we need to help them find something else to do that can be narrated as a form of generosity, serving the common good, etc. So, we'll come back to this in just a minute, this notion of expanding the practice of generosity. But once you begin to think about expanding the practice of generosity and understanding, then maybe we can begin to understand how I can say 100% of our resources and 100% of our time is stewardship. I'm not saying everyone empty your checkbook into the church's coffers, although some of us might like that. You know, when we broaden the understanding of generosity, then we begin to see, hey, maybe all dimensions of my life and every way I use resources can be understood as a form of generosity. Next point. Uh-oh, I think I may have gotten ahead of myself. Let's see. No, we're still good. A key thing, we have to challenge the culture of consumerism. Based on their interviews with Christians across the nation, Smith and his colleagues conclude that perhaps the single greatest obstacle to faithful Christian stewardship is that big red button. I just love that. The single greatest obstacle to faithful Christian stewardship is the mass consumerism of contemporary North American culture. Both laity and clergy report that this is their number one obstacle. We can't afford to give. We feel like we're just getting by as it is. Tithing is unrealistic, our bills come first, our fixed expenses are growing. Think of the proliferation of subscriptions, right? Stuff we used to be able to pay once for, we now got to pay for over and over and over and over and over. Our fixed costs seem to be growing all the time, which is squeezing our discretionary spending. We live in financial fear, insecurity. Our economic status is uncertain. We live on the edge of relative deprivation, relative compared to others, compared to where we want to be. In the Spirit, through the Spirit, we must liberate folks from bondage to consumerist culture. And this entails addressing lifestyle models, norms, and goals. Think of that quote from C.S. Lewis that I started with. He says, how much should we give? Enough that it pinches. Enough that we can't quite do the things that everyone else in our sort of socioeconomic sphere can do because we're giving. Have we ever heard that in the church? I try to think back in my life, and I'm like, I've never gotten any guidance. No models have ever been lifted up to me for sort of what I should be aiming for in terms of lifestyle models, norms, and goals. We need to help folks sort out the difference between needs and wants. And there's some really interesting stuff here. I don't have it on my resource list. I'll just mention an author, Juliet Shore, S-H-O-R. Juliet Shore. She's got some really interesting work on children and affluence, but also just on the overspent, overworked American, a couple of wonderful books, and how she does a wonderful job of sort of narrating how a previous generation's wants become our needs. I mean, you know, right? How many of us would now say a cell phone is a need? 30 years ago, we didn't even dream of cell phones, right? They weren't needs. They weren't wants. When they first came out, they were wants. Everyone's carrying around those big suitcase things, right? Remember those? So, you know, we have to help people. We have to help people distinguish between wants and needs. I have a friend who's a theologian. He used to tell me when he was raising his kids on Saturday morning, he had these big, it's just crazy, but he's a crazy guy. He had these styrofoam bricks, and when the commercials would come on with his little kids watching the commercials, he'd come in the room and say, what are they teaching you to do? And they'd say in unison, they're teaching us to want stuff we don't need, and then they'd throw the foam bricks at the TV. I'm not saying we got to teach our congregation members to do that, but because then they might start throwing them at us. But you know, we need to help people. People need help. How do we distinguish between a want and a need? That big red button is designed to circumvent that reflection. Hit it, don't think about it. And people get paid to think about that. Just as you were saying, you're reverse engineering this stuff, you know, they're marketers. You know this, right? They're now doing MRI study. Somehow they strap MRIs to people's heads, and they go in the shopping mall, and then they record what's happening in their brains. So they now know this is how we need to place products based on what they've learned about them. You know, they're totally trying to circumvent, you know, everything. Forget the button. They're trying to get us to where we don't even need the button. We just see it and go. They're working that hard at it. We need to work at least as hard to lift up the gifts of God, the means of grace, the spiritual disciplines, to counter it. Our words, our hope, believe in Jesus for the next life, we're abandoning folks in this life. And we want to help, we want to enjoy the good life here and now, right? We want to enjoy salvation now, not just sometime in the future. Part of helping folks challenge consumer culture means helping them deal with their sense of objective resource constraint. Sorry, I got behind on my button here. You know, so many people think, look at my fixed costs, I can't do more. But the reality is that many fixed expenses are determined by voluntary consumption. We buy the most expensive house or the best car with the most features, the phones, TVs, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of what we say is fixed. It's not that fixed. It rests on prior choices. Same thing with subjective resource constraint. This is the status discontent, the anxiety, to trying to keep up with the Joneses, as they say, right? We need to address that head on. We need to address that head on. Who should we be trying to keep up with? Not the Joneses, but Jesus, right? Jesus is out there giving himself away to our neighbors, to the poor, the downtrodden, to the rich, everybody. We should just be tagging along, grabbing the Spirit's coattails, letting us carry us along. Right? It's no longer we who live, but Christ who lives in us. And this resource constraint is not just about money, it's also about time. I think I have time for a couple minutes. So here's a quote to think about from one of the generosity studies. The challenge is to give, despite our other commitments, to find ways in the course of paying bills and juggling schedules to carve out care for others. People who give generously do not have more discretionary income or time or resources than non-givers. Rather, they see what they have as enough and they choose to give. It's not like we're all going to find some magical time when we have more money than we know what to do with, when we have more time than we know what to do with, when we have more resources than what we know what to do with. Rather, we find ways to use what we have now. What we have now is enough. And give. The other thing this depends on is, of course, courage. The stuff I've talked about, right, you're going to go home and say, please don't mention my name. I went to the seminary and somebody said we should give our building to the community. That's not going to be easy. It takes courage. Indeed, Smith reports that people are overwhelmingly against requiring tithing. Although there are religious communities, so I know some Christian communities, I'm not talking about Mormons, I'm talking about Christian communities that do practice this. And Judaism, of course, practices. Maybe we could learn. Right? Let's go to the local rabbi and talk to him. Say, how do you do this? How does it work? It scares the bejeebies out of me. What do you do? So it's going to require courage. And then the last point before my conclusion, stewardship and race. I think we're okay on time. If I run over a couple minutes, I think there's a 15-minute summary built in. I'm just going to give up my summary time and run with this. There's an opportunity to bring together the two parts of my presentation. This morning where we talked about obstacles, and this afternoon where I tried to put some practices for moving forward in place. And to bring to the fore some important clarifications regarding the practice of stewardship. I'm going to offer a few, admittedly, maybe even confessedly, rudimentary reflections on stewardship and the practice of race. And I'm going to leave them kind of like the shorter ending of Mark, as an invitation to continue to work out our vocation as stewards of God's grace in our lives. So the first point I want to make is that in our consumerist economy, globally and nationally, is built on white supremacy. slavery and its initiation, and there is actually ongoing slavery today in the world, for those of you who don't know it. There's a wonderful book called Disposable People that really unpacks that. Slavery and the use of whiteness as a wage. W.E. Du Bois coined the phrase of whiteness as a kind of wage, and that still is used today. So that race is a means of disciplining and repressing labor, exploiting African Americans, and powerless whites, not that the two should ever be equated or leveled, equal, yeah. In other words, there are racially driven economic disparities. It's not just about class, which means that stewardship is not colorblind. How so? Much of the treatment of stewardship presumes a white middle-class point of view. For example, the definitions of giving and generosity focus narrowly on surplus wealth and time. And as suggested, we need to expand our understanding of generosity beyond this to include, for example, self-sufficiency, to include relational generosity. One of the unfortunate things about whiteness is it's a kind of solipsism. Whiteness entails a vision of ourselves as not really having a history or a heritage or roots, no people that we are obligated to beyond what we voluntarily choose to be connected to. Now, you Lutherans in some ways, because you still maintain some kind of ethnic heritage, there is a rootedness there that's a good thing. And that maybe will help you get into this relational understanding of generosity, sharing with other people to whom you're connected beyond your voluntary choices. So we need to expand generosity to include self-sufficiency, relational generosity, vocational generosity, right? Think of the service industry. Think of all the folks who work for a low wage and high risk. Some of this has come to the fore during COVID, right? In the service industry, where people of color are disproportionately represented, and women of color triply so, right? We can talk about Bell Hooks and Kimberly Kenshaw's understanding of intersectionality for how these things all run together. But the point is, when we narrowly think of generosity in terms of surplus wealth and surplus time, we're sort of excluding the lived reality of people other than ourselves. Stewardship tends to focus on giving with little concern for how surplus was acquired. Why do I have surplus money and time? White supremacy lives in the silence of that unasked question. As again, people of color disproportionately are represented in lower income and multiple jobs. So stewardship should not whitewash resources. And as per, that's one of the reasons I read that long quote by Augustine, by Aquinas today, as per Ambrose and Augustine and Wesley and Aquinas and Basil and Luther and countless others, stewardship is a matter of justice, what we owe to the other person, not simply a matter of charity. So unjust acquisition is a rupture, a breach, an interruption of the universal destination of material goods. Right, my whole presentation this morning was about giving what we are and what we have, but I didn't ask how did we get it. Now, some of it we know how we got. God gave us ourselves. God gave us our talents. I mean, we don't all believe that. Some of us think we're self-made persons. But a fuller understanding of stewardship will also consider how we got what we have. How did I get the extra time? How did I get the surplus wealth? Failing to ask that question allows white supremacy to continue to work through our economy where certain people are exploited so other people can benefit. And that fits the tradition. That's why I brought in Ambrose, Augustine, Wesley, etc. Right? They're all concerned about justice and understand stewardship as a matter of justice, not charity, as we understand it. Again, sorry for my slowness on these clickers. I'm just not good at it. Speaking of the universal destination of material goods, the labor of communion, as Chris Smith you're probably getting tired of his name, but he does just a wonderful work in so many interesting areas. As Chris Smith and Michael Emerson in their book Divided by Faith tell us, white folks don't know many black folks, and few on a very intimate level. As a result of not knowing black folks, we are unaware of and so disbelieving in the ongoing effects of white supremacy. We don't know many African Americans, certainly not at any kind of intimate level, and we don't see racism going on around us. Therefore, we don't actually believe it's really still happening. Moreover, as Smith again shows in this study, we're interviewing all these Christians on these matters, we are largely committed to a solely attitudinal understanding of racism. Racism is just about attitudes. We just don't believe in something. We refuse to see the structural institutional forms that shape our lives. So again, this comes out of Smith's study. It was an eye-opening thing for me to realize, for some reason, white folks just don't see structures and institutions. If you want to change, don't talk to me about structures and institutions. We've seen this huge backlash in our culture against the critical race theory. And that's what it is, right? The objection is, don't tell me structures are behind racism. Racism is just about personal attitudes. And I swear I don't have the personal attitude, therefore there can't be a problem. White Christians just don't believe in structures and institutions like that. It's weird. So we don't know, so we don't believe, and we refuse to see. Stewardship as the renewal of communion. Stewardship is the renewal of communion. It entails metanoia, conversion, change, in the sense of openness to others, right? That's the whole gift. God's turning us out from ourselves and open to others. And confronting, confessing the powers and the principalities that hold us in bondage and interfere with communion. You see what I just did, right? I used the language powers and principalities. That's a theological language that you can use maybe to help folks begin to think about structures and institutions. That's theological language. It's out of the Bible. It's not from CRT. Although it wouldn't surprise me if somebody figures the Bible's been infected by CRT, but that's a different problem, right? And, because this actually comes out of the Lutheran tradition, right? What does Christus Victor do? Think back to your theological studies. Christus Victor is the model of atonement that says Christ is the victor. Christ is the one who liberates us from bondage to sin. Liberates us from things that are beyond our sheer willpower. Right? We like to think sin is just a matter of willpower. I can just will myself out of it. But the truth is, right? The Christian claim is that we are in bondage to sin. It's an addiction, right? It's impervious to our willpower. I've tried really long time to be nice to people, especially students. I can't do it. I need to be set free. It's beyond my willpower to escape. That's Christus Victor. That's not CRT. That's Christus Victor. Christ liberates us from bondage to sin. That's a way to help think through this barrier. Relevant here might be understanding generosity and stewardship as political activism. It's because I care about you, because I want to be in communion with you, that I suddenly become more politically active, not just for my own interests, but political activism as a form of generosity, reaching out to, sharing with others. And not just as protest, but it's also about advocacy and examining how our voting lines up with our philanthropy. How many of us give resources to address problems that our voting and advocacy makes worse? This drives me bonkers. I know all kinds of people who are super generous in giving to causes, and I'm like, well, darn it, stop voting the way you vote, and we wouldn't have quite the problems you keep giving money to. So stewardship as giving and trying to increase this communion means, protesting against things we don't like. It means advocacy and voting for things that we ought to support, but it also means asking how our voting maybe contradicts our stewardship. I don't think you all get bored if you take some of these things with you. You have a lot to do. That's another. This is another lacuna where we don't talk about voting lining up with philanthropy. That's another gap where white supremacy can hide. Finally, and I'll close with this. I'm terrible at these little clickers. Last point. Finally, I recall when seminarians participated in a homeworks project, some of y'all may have been involved in it, right? To renovate a home a few blocks from the seminary. A large group of young white persons, not exactly dressed in their Sunday best, walked into a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And guess what happened? Nothing. No police showed up to check it out. No one rolled up to make a citizen's arrest. And I wonder what would the response be if a similarly attired group of African-American young people walked into a predominantly white neighborhood, let's say the Summit up where I used to live, and was unfortunately in the news a couple years ago. Say a group of young African-Americans, similarly dressed to the way we were dressed when we went down the street here, to install a ramp for an elderly white woman. How long would it be before the police showed up to check it out? Who might show up to make a citizen's arrest? And once when I was a kid, a teenager I think, I stopped to help a white woman change a tire on the side of the road late at one night. I didn't even give it a second thought. If I was a person of color, would I be taking my life into my hands in doing that? My point. So white supremacy remains an obstacle to stewardship in terms of generosity, in terms of white practice and how we give or don't give. That's kind of clear, simple to grasp. But white supremacy is also an obstacle to stewardship and generosity in terms of it being an obstacle to African American practice of generosity. Now, since the gift of stewardship, since God gives us the gift of stewardship, because God wants to bless us with communion, it behooves white folks who wish to receive the abundant life that God gives in and through the gift of others to work to overcome white supremacy. My life is deprived when I am barred from receiving the gift of my African American sisters and brothers. What I'm getting at here is that stewardship and generosity are not synonymous with a white man's burden to uplift others. It is not white noblesse oblige, where we wealthy folks have an obligation to give some resources to other people, mostly to magnify our own power. It is as much about my need to receive the gift of others as it is for me to give. You follow? Not saying you have to agree, I just want to make sure I'm sort of clear on what I'm trying to communicate. And so white supremacy is not only an obstacle because it distorts how I give and to whom I give, it is an obstacle because it prevents me from receiving the gift of others, specifically my African American sisters and brothers. Stewardship entails working to tear down the barriers, the walls, the fences to receiving the gift of others. And yes, I'm referring to Ephesians 2:14. So I'll stop here before I continue and say something really stupid and outrageous. So to conclude, best of all, God is with us. Best of all, God is with us. Stewardship is about the church learning to embrace the freedom that God gives us to give ourselves away. And such vulnerability can be frightening. But our fears should not cloud or diminish the reality that stewardship is a gift. It is part and parcel of the good news that God gives us. Right? God gives us stewardship as an opportunity to be turned out from ourselves and receive the abundance, the joy, the grace that comes, the gifts, the blessings that come through the presence of others in our lives. And I suspect that if the church were more freely to give itself away, we would discover profound joy. After all, God gives us stewardship because God wants to bless us more richly and abundantly than we could ever ask or imagine by expanding the circle of love. Moreover, I think we would discover that God in Christ has given and continues to give us all that we need. After all, the good news is that we cannot outgive God. We cannot give away more than God provides. The Lord is our shepherd, we shall not want. Even if in this time between the times, that provision looks like resurrection. Resurrection is, after all, good news. Thank you. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
If we take about an 8-minute break and then do the final panel.
Okay.
So we'll reconvene at 2:20.
Thanks, Sean.
Panelists, just be bold and go ahead and start.
It has research. Now, right?
Yeah, that's true.
All right, so we get started? All right. So you all heard the question that I opened the second session with, which is, can we imagine a congregation where no campaign was necessary and it wasn't supported by an endowment? You know, what would that culture look like? What would leading that church look like? What would joining that church look like? So if you all want to start there, feel free. But again, I'm just interested in hearing what you all have to say about any of this in general, either fixing some of the stupid things I said or building on them or going your own direction. I'd love to hear your wisdom. So that was the opening question, but I don't want you to feel like you're stuck to that.
And I'll go ahead and start. And I will confess that your question wasn't nearly as interesting to me as the last 30 minutes of your presentation, and thank you for that. That was, would gladly cede my 5 minutes to hear you talk about that some more. But I did give some thought to it ahead of time. So I had mentioned during the panel after the first session, after the morning session, that for our congregation, attendance has not been a good predictor of the financial part of our stewardship. And that's really not to say that on a given Sunday we're giving well or giving average or giving poorly. It just means that we can't tell what an offering will be like from the physical attendance. Now that may be a new trend. We may have succeeded in separating attendance from stewardship. And in some ways that would be a good trend. It's also possible that giving is simply a lag indicator, and it's the last thing that we forget how to do. After we've forgotten how to gather, after we've forgotten to love Holy Communion, we'll finally at some point forget why we're giving. Now let's assume for the moment that that's not what's going on. And that really what's happening in our congregation and a lot of yours too is a bellwether for a life without stewardship appeals. And I think that's a real possibility, and it's something we're kind of hoping for. We're moving in that direction, not by design, but we seem to be getting there just on our own. And one of the things we've noticed is that electronic giving has really changed the way we think about fall stewardship. Our electronic giving right now hovers between 30 and 40%. And as that number goes up, we find less and less relevance to that one Sunday in the fall where we hope to have lots and lots of people there to turn in statement of intent cards. And in fact, what we discovered this last fall was that a lot of people who had made electronic commitments didn't realize that they were expected to turn in a statement of intent card. And we made some attempt to ask them if they would turn it in anyway, just so we could compare this year to last year. And eventually our stewardship consultant said, listen, why don't you just treat all of those as if they were statement of intent cards? But in that, I can see a future where we're not so locked in on that one Sunday in the fall. And if that happens, if we're not training all of our energy on that particular Sunday when we need most of the congregation to be there to turn in a card, that really frees us up to do what we've wanted to do all along, which is just to tell stories of how you've shared and how you've experienced generosity, how you've experienced gratefulness during the year. What worked really well for us this year was doing, let's call them mission moments. By the way, we've tried to kill the term temple talk. We've tried to kill it with every weapon we can think of. It will not die. It'll never die. We market it all year as a mission moment, and somebody comes in late and says, "What's going on up there?" And the members say it's a temple talk. But we kind of turned a corner with them, though, and temple talks by themselves will always want to be about the institution and not about God. So this is what Ebenezer means to me. And they always seem to want to default to stories of obligation rather than stories of generosity. But this year we really felt like we had sort of turned, and people were more comfortable talking about generosity, more comfortable talking about God. We see that as a hopeful trend, and also one that may come along with stewardship being something we're doing all year, and being more and more liberated from Stewardship Sunday. We pause there and I'll hand it to somebody.
One thing that I think is pretty interesting is the idea of building in generosity into your congregation's founding principles or guiding principles. The work that I'm excited about with this Digital First mission in the North Carolina Synod is we're pledging to be a 50-50 congregation, where 50% of what we receive goes out. We're kind of living into that giving yourself away model that you spoke to. So we will always do that, and I think that that's exciting because it gets people a little bit more interested in giving when you're blessing the work of others as well.
All right, so the notion around culture change is related to three aspects. It's related to ideas, people, and actions. So I'll state that again. You have ideas, you have people, and you have actions. So if you want to do a culture change, one idea that's very prevalent, particularly among young people, based upon research, is this, that the church is disloyal. I'll state that again, that the church is disloyal. I was at a youth conference, once large youth conference, denominational conference, and posed the question to a large group of young people across racial and economic spectrum, and about 99% of them stated and stood up when I posed the question and said, is the church disloyal? Yes. So there was no explanation or definition of what loyalty or disloyalty was, just based upon the posing of the question, their initial response, the church is disloyal. Therefore, if the church is disloyal, there's a lack of distrust or distrust toward the church, and no one gives to something that they are distrust. Let me state that again. No one gives towards something that they distrust. So that raises a bunch of questions related to not just ideas, but particular actions and people, right? So what level of transparency do we have in terms of what our finances or our resources? That's very important, right? Number two, who are the individuals in place? That's important. So if you have an individual in place that's on a committee or a treasurer or something related to finances, and people have a definite distrust for them, or even dislike, then they are more apt to say, no, I won't give toward this because I don't trust person. Even if I trust a sense of mission or cause, because this person is associated with it, I won't give because they are connected to it, right? It's very, very important. What are your policies? What are your processes, right? Then there's also ideas related to what? If we want to talk about being generous, et cetera, we have to know our constituency, but we also have to have ideas and conversations about debt. I'll state that again. Churches can talk generosity, but we have to have a conversation about debt. People can't give more if they are in debt. People can't give or give to the maximum level that they have capacity to give. So therefore, there's one congregation, right, a large African-American congregation with some of the, at least 2 or 3, some of the richest people in the country go to this congregation. I was part of this congregation. Super rich, right? One of the conversations that they had related to mission, we didn't do any stewardship campaign when I was there. They did it after I left. But one of the conversations that the congregation had, which actually increased our generosity and our sense of mission and community related to our finances and intellectual capital, was what? Debt. So when the church members, individuals who attended the church and people in the community begin to get out of debt, and church celebrates person getting out of debt, whether that's a medical bill, a credit card, or a school loan, guess what? The sense of celebration generated a sense of more communal celebration. Now when you attach that to a sense of mission, now that we are less debt as a church and as individuals, what can we do with this notion of what? Extra money, right? Last thing I'll say is this, right? We have to begin to foster a culture related to resources, ideas related to resources. Not simply related to mission or what we should do with our resources, but ideas related to what are our resources, right? As they would say in black church, if I was preaching a sermon on David, what's in your hand? So what's in your hand and what's out of your hand? What do we have access to, right? So we have to have an idea of giving related to, it's more than Sunday morning. If you want to have a culture of giving, then it's more than Sunday morning giving. It should not be limited to Sunday morning, but it has to expand to what are the resources accessible to us, right? If I might have about 1 minute, I'll give an example, right? A few examples, right? Church that I pastored, we were doing a building project. I didn't do stewardship, right? Building project, one of the things we did was we did research as a congregation. Note that. Research as a congregation, and we found out that there were utility incentives and programs within our municipality that no other church tried to access. We were the only church, one of the only churches in the state of New Jersey that got it, right? It was there. The congregation did research together. We found it. We put it in. Guess what? It gave us what? More capacity based on something else that was there. But we did the research. Corporate matching gifts, right? We had individuals in our congregation that congregations their jobs would match nonprofits, right? We took the risk, we tried, that's a match, we connected it to something, right? Pro bono service, we did all of these things. Construction giving, right? Reaching out to people that says, we have this need, who will do this pro bono for us so that we can use our operation budget for our mission in our community, right? And I would suggest for some of us to do this. Maybe we should what? Explore a community development corporation. It's kind of a thing that Black Church has been doing forever, right? Because what? Grants can come to it, and some individuals in community will not give to a church, but they will give to that community development corporation, right? Johnson & Johnson, whatever, will give to that to foster a sense of what? Mission and community, right? And then I guess I will state this, right? Buildings. Buildings that sit there unused every day do not generate what? They don't foster mission and community, and they don't generate any revenue. So how can we creatively use our building space as innovation labs, as co-worker space, right? To what? Some churches build what? Housing. All types of things to be able to generate income and have a sense of community. And the last thing I'll say, which will end on this pause, is maybe we should sell the building, go small in order to go big in community. So I can say that because I'm a professor, I'm not pastoring, and I have no connection to any of you, so don't send an email because I won't read it. If you got a big building and not doing anything with it, sell it. There's a mega church that just sold their building. They had 10,000 people in service. 10,000 people Sunday morning, every Sunday. And they said in order to have more mission and community, it's a wise financial decision to sell the building and expand our food bank and our outreach and community and do our services online.
What was I thinking? I should have gone first. So it's an interesting panel because we are all completely different, and everything I've heard so far, I'm fascinated to hear more about. But mine's completely different. The question is, what would leading the church in a culture, what would leading, how to do this, I guess, so that you don't have a stewardship campaign, how to lead. And I thought, preach the text is one of my answers. I'm a New Testament person, and I'm a preacher, and I remember Will Willimon saying at one point, just hunker down behind the text and, and preach that word. I don't make the news, people, I just report it, right? And the news is often very closely connected to stewardship, and it's certainly connected to stewardship in this broad sense, that all that we have and all that we are belongs to God and has no accounting for taste, just like your call, right? You say, I don't know what God was thinking. I don't know what God was thinking, providing all this to us, but danged if God hasn't. And given that, oh my gosh, what's possible? Yeah, I never preached a decent stewardship sermon on Stewardship Sunday, right, on the gathering of the in cards or whatever those things are. But I had when the text worked with that, it was it worked for the congregation. So try preaching the text. And I know you all do. I don't mean that in a snarky way. And then I was reminded, especially around, and you didn't say this, Dr. Bell, but you were talking about the focus on surplus is a kind of white middle class perspective. I thought about how shaming it is, whether you're white and middle class or something else, when all you hear about stewardship is giving away surplus, and you just don't have an imagination of surplus in your own world. And so what you learn is, oh, I don't belong here. Or I have to fake it to be part of this community. Among other things you learn with a sort of surplus mentality, language around giving. And then I went from that to a statement that is popular in addiction therapy in AA and so on, which is you're only as sick as your secrets. So, and the hiding that Dr. Bell talked about, that we have around money and around our own use of what's been given to us in our congregations. And then I went to confession and forgiveness. We start every week, Lutherans start every week with this, we are in bondage to sin and cannot free ourselves. And then, or we are captive now, we say in a new hymnal, to sin and cannot free ourselves. And then someone says to us, you know what, Christus Victor, you are freed from that. And then we have the rest of the service of living ahead of time in things like sharing the peace and coming to the table and listening again and finding ourselves in the story. So I thought of this all from a liturgical perspective.
Thank you. I mean, that's just wonderful. You said it better. All of you said it better than I could have said or tried to say. I mean, the debt stuff is crucial. Debt is one of the ways we're all tied into this consumer culture, and that's where, there's criticisms we made of the stuff like Dave Ramsey. And I have no idea if Dave Ramsey's had any grip at all in the black church, but I've seen the work he's done in white churches. And I can tell you funny stories about him. I don't know how I got talking to this guy in the gym in Columbia who's got nothing to do with the church. And so I brought him the Dave Ramsey book, and next thing he's around the gym, and then he's like, it's up in Simpsonville, going around his families and friends and relatives. I was not weird, but it really helped him. It helps him get a handle on this debt problem. Because that is how we are tied in. It's not just the button. As much as I love that button thing, it's not just the button, it's debt that ties us in. And we've got to deal with it. We've got to help people deal with it. Expanding the notion of generosity is tied into your comments as well. That was huge. Even when I was doing this research, I realized how much I was trapped in that. And to expand how we think about generosity, there's relational generosity. And this is the shaming you talked about. The worst case of the shaming I ever saw is the church that posted up in an overhead projector like this the money amounts of the largest donations. Not even percentages, but the money amounts. You could maybe use the widow's mite for an argument for why percentages might be a good way, but not the totals. This, the highest donor in our church gave $50,000, while everyone else feels like crap. And we need to expand the notion of generosity, because there are people who don't have huge margins of surplus, but they're nevertheless, their whole lives are a form of generosity. Again, think of the service workers in COVID. These folks for little pay, which makes our lives cheaper when they're willing to work for less. And they're putting themselves at risk and their health at risk to serve us. That is a form of generosity that we need to honor. And I always think, well, we're going to put the corporate CEOs on the heads of our boards and stuff. But you know what? The low-wage person that's taking a risk and getting up every day in the dark without any gratitude and recognition and giving their life away in service, they are probably the person we should put on the board, and not the CEO who gives a pittance. I remember a couple years ago, who was it? Some big-name celebrity type who decided they were going to give away what they made on the stock market that day, and it was millions or something. And then people, oh, isn't that amazing? I'm like, are you kidding me? They woke up this morning without it, and the stock market gives it to them, and they give them away, and we're praising them for that? Again, the widow's mite, the person who labors for little pay, for little recognition, at great risk, they may be the person we need to learn from for generosity. And that requires us to broaden our understanding of what generosity is. And that requires us to stop tying it so closely to the church building and the church programs. And I know one of the fears is, right? Because I just gotta be careful what I say here. I once had the pleasure of watching a bishop come absolutely unglued and actually make strangling motions, like they wanted to strangle a pastor, because somehow the pastor had somehow gotten the idea of the congregation that stewardship meant giving to more than the congregation. And the bishop almost came unglued. And I suspect the fear is, right, if we tell folks to give to other things, we're afraid they won't give to us. My congregation just made an appeal to us for our stewardship campaign. You know, give to us because we give to the food bank. And I'm like, why don't I just give straight to the food bank? Right? What's the benefit of me giving to the church to give to the food bank? You know, they'll get 100% if I just give it to the food bank. Right? I think we fear that by telling folks to give to other things. I'd love to be a part of a stewardship where they said, all right, this week we're going to tell you to give to Amnesty International, or we're going to tell you to give to this or that. I'd be shocked. Trust God. Trust God. Help the church give itself away and hope and pray and trust that we won't be left behind. Thank the preaching the text. You know, when I was writing this thing, I said, tell a better story. And I didn't like using that language because I was afraid it'd come off like my story is better than yours. It's not my story. It's Jesus' fault. You know, just preach the text. And, you know, I said how one of the huge problems is that clergy don't have their own lives in order. We can just say we don't like it either. I do this all the time. Love your enemies. I don't want to love my enemies. I don't want to forgive 70 times 7. Don't get mad at me. I'm mad too. Get mad at Jesus. Right? That's good news, though. We got to trust him. So I love that. Just preach the text. Don't tell a better story like Professor Bell's story is better than the one you used to tell, or your story is better than your story. Just preach the text. And get out of the way. Stand with your congregation. Admit this is hard for us because we're in bondage. I get it. Give all that you have. That's scary because we're in bondage. And we can point to the one who promises to set us free and says it is good news, as scary as it looks. Get out of the boat, walk on the water. Are you kidding me? I'll sink. So I love that. It was a wonderful reminder. It's not my story. It's not a better story. It's just the truth. Just tell them the truth. I remember once talking to a congregation, a church, about coming to speak there. And actually, for different and odd reasons, I was going to come and speak about race, and the pastor told me, my congregation's not ready for that. And I remember thinking, what? They're not ready for the truth? They're not ready for good news? What kind of pastor protects their church from the good news? I think that's, again, this came to mind when you said, just preach the text and trust Jesus. We don't need to protect people from Jesus. Even we can stand with the people and say, ouch, sometimes Jesus kind of stings, you know, like when he said, whitewash sepulchres. You know, we can admit that sometimes it stings, but that just says we're in bondage, and thank God Christus Victor sets us free. The asset-based community development. Did y'all notice the language I used? When I first wrote this, I said, sell your churches. And I said, no, wait a second. What I ended up saying was, give your church to the community. You may have heard that as sell your church, and that might be what giving your church to the community means, but it doesn't have to be that. There's lots of ways to give your building to the community. It may entail selling it, it may entail not selling it. The point is, like you were saying so well, give the building to the community. What other use do we have for it? Explore house churches, explore storefront churches, I don't care. I mean, we can all name congregations, right, that have been crippled by their buildings. How much of their line item budget goes into maintaining the building? A couple of years ago, the United Methodist bishops were lamenting because they're like, we're trapped by all our buildings because we've got all these buildings where the people no longer are. Maybe we need to set up tabernacles again, I don't know, and travel with them. Just, again, I'm just thanking you all for the things you said that were fit in with what I was thinking and making it better. So I'll go home and add these things to it. Anything else? Anything else you all want to add? Comments, complaints, criticisms, corrections, additions?
Yeah, on the subject of giving our buildings to the community, something I've been researching lately is the UMC's model of cooperative parishes, which essentially invites in another organization, usually another denomination or another church with a different ethnic background, and gives them equal ownership of that building and equal use, and is kind of a way of yoking each other together towards greater unity and purpose.
Some of the stuff that I just read recently says, before COVID, I believe 75 and 100 houses of worship, that's a broad term, more than Christian, houses of worship are shutting down a week. And there are now experts that are saying that that could double. There are even some who suggest that in the next few years, 30% of the houses of worship may close. Our buildings are becoming anchors. I won't argue whether or not they were ever a good thing. I'll just say, but now in this culture, in this time and place, they're becoming anchors. And to begin to think about other ways to use them. You use a cooperative parish. Why not a cathedral model where there's one worship space? And notice I'm not calling it a church. We, the people, are the church. There's a worship space that maybe is shared by several different congregations, even several different denominations. It's kind of a cathedral model. There's just all kinds of things. There's a house church movement out there. By the way, think of how the buildings tied us up in COVID. And all these pastors, I mentioned it, right? Darn it, my building's not an essential space. Something's wrong with Christianity if our building is an essential space. And the earlier comment this morning about connected and beyond, I love that, because the whole time I'm thinking, and this is not directed at you, okay? The whole time I'm thinking, where did we ever get the idea that, being Christians and connecting to another has to go through the church, has to go through the building, has to go through Sundays. We need to work on connecting parishioner to parishioner that isn't mediated by the building or us. So that when something like COVID happens, building burns down, tornado hits it, we've already got connections. We already know each other. This idea of talking to one another besides the week, well, that's normal. That's what it means to be a Christian community. That's why I said one of my suggestions was encourage people to move closer together. It's not the only way to do it. Digitally, yes, is certainly one way. Or these vocational groups where all the people in the congregation meet regularly. That happens, COVID happens, okay, we can't use our space, we can't have large gatherings, no problem. We already have house churches in our congregation. We already do mobile communion, right? You put all the stuff in the back of the pickup truck, you drive into a neighborhood, and tell the parishioners in your neighborhood they're going to host it. What an evangelism tool as well, right? We're all figuring out how do we have everybody come to the church building to do communion and all the health problems with that and whatever. Why do people want to come to the building for communion? I'm pretty sure Jesus will move outside the building if you ask nicely. And I got that idea from a Catholic parish I heard of, right? The priest got in the back of the pickup truck and they drove in the neighborhood and they celebrated communion. I'm thinking that's a wonderful ecumenical opportunity, evangelistic opportunity, right? And that creates these connections between people in the congregation that doesn't depend on that. And the same thing with the virtual space, because one of the huge problems post-COVID is, right, some people are going online and not coming back. I admit I'm one of them. As long as my church has got my online church, I can't figure out a good reason to go back to the building. Which gets back to the conversation we had this morning about what are we offering. For the virtual folks who won't come back, find out where they live. Find out what parishioners live in their neighborhood and then encourage them to get together. Again, finding ways to make connections with parishioners, Christians as church, that doesn't require the mediation of the building or the professional staff, which I know puts us at risk because we want to make sure we're important and we still got our paycheck. But again, trust Jesus. So, again, these are all things that you all kicked up and I appreciate it. I'm now going to have to go home and rewrite this, put all this in there. So, yeah. Anything else?
Try to use the microphone. No, I'm not. Okay, there we go. That's as close as I'm going to get. So this is probably my Lutheran showing. But it occurs to me how much of this is identity. Because for me, and that I may be unique in this, but a lot of the things that I go online and I start hunting around for are aspirational, right? January 1st, we're all like, yeah, dumbbells. We're all gonna use those this year. The buy that now button is the button that goes, yeah, you're gonna get that in the mail, you are never gonna touch that again. And so part of the acquisition, the consumerism, is aspirational identity that is not rooted in baptism. In baptism, I'm enough. And the other thing is control, which of course goes back into identity, right? Because some of what you're talking about with decentralizing the locus of church is control. Part of the, I mean, most of this congregational conflict that I've seen involves closet space, right? Oh my gosh. Why do we have to argue about how much space the preschool gets versus the food pantry? They're both good things. It's control. Sharing space is control. Figuring out how to give away our budget and to trust people with our budget, whether that's individuals giving to the congregation or the congregation pouring that out into the world, is control. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it all seems to come back down to that baptismal identity for me.
Sure. There is this notion that Rowan Williams and others raises called holy insecurity. You know, control is also connected to fear and to security. And learning to live in holy insecurity, vulnerable, open to others, taking risks, being willing to lose, recognizing that those who lose their life will find it, and the last shall be first, etc. I don't know how this piggybacks on what you said, but also making connections besides the building. And this may be silly, but it's hopefully maybe not. Somebody once asked me, if a stranger walked into the house, could they tell you're a Christian? And that strikes me the more I think about it as a really interesting thing. Do we help our parishioners understand their homes as sacred spaces? What artwork do they have on? Crosses, I don't know, take your pick. But you know, that might help people feel connected. They're not alone, they don't have to just come to the building, that their home can be a house church, right? And there's ways to connect, even simple things. And the reason I did that is related to your comment about identity. We get bombarded all the time in our society by images of the consumer life. How do we counter that? You said you were countering by re-engineering the button. How do we counter that? Our church spaces are so barren of art often, right? Our homes the same way. You know, why don't we give out with baptism to everyone a reproduction of Grunewald's small crucifixion with John the Baptist pointing at the Lamb of God, saying, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." How's that for helping us think about identity? So every home in our congregation has something like. There's better ones. Right? You know, I used to have a ton of them up in my office. There's tons of things like that. We need the images constantly before us to remind us who we are. We need to constantly tell the stories. I assume you all do some of the things that I do. I find really powerful quotes. I've got quotes from, that Luther quote that I love so much about, give yourself away. I have that right beside my bed, and I just constantly meditate on it. It's constantly there. It's a reminder. So it gets into my head, and that begins to form how I think and see the world. Do we help our parishioners do stuff like that? We give them information, we give them words on Sunday morning, but do we actually give them things that they can hold on to? Remember there's a time when I said that you all should institute in your congregations take your pastor to work day?
I've done that, it's fun.
Awesome, right? To help sanctify their workspace. Maybe you leave some things on their desk, things for them to remember who and whose they are in all the spaces of their life. We're just not competing well, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Again, inspired by what you said. So we don't do a good job competing against consumerism. I can't believe I just used the language of compete in a positive way, because that's not Think more these ways, all right? Help people's identities, imaginations be captured by these stories of abundance. I was doing the research for this, and I stumbled across the feeding of the crowds, and then it clicked. I don't know why I hadn't called it this, but it's not that we have abundance and give it away, but the abundance is discovered in the sharing and giving. It blew my mind. Now that image, that story is going to stick with me a long time and form we need those images. We need to think how we can help those images and models be set before our parishioners so that it shapes our identity. And if we're not doing that, we're just not competing well. Well, I'm exhausted. I'm done talking. So if you all want to talk
Thank you,
some
Dr.
more,
Bell. Thank you, panel, and
yourselves.
thank all of you for coming. Please leave evaluations and name tags in the box on the registration desk. And come next year.
Thanks, y'all.